Welcome to The Laws of Style, featuring conversations on creativity, fashion, and the law from the leading edge of our economy and culture. Hosted by noted fashion lawyer Douglas Hand.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast, The Laws of Style, downloading to you from the offices of the law firm HBA, high above Bryant Park in the Fashion District of New York City. I'm your host, Douglas Hand, fashion lawyer, fashion law professor, and self-styled well-dressed man. And I'm joined by friend and, candidly, fashion industry titan, Fern Mallis. Fern, thanks for being with us today.
Good morning. Happy to be here.
So, I think little known fact, but you started, in a sense, in publishing, writing your way on to Mademoiselle during a college writing competition. Tell us about that and how that informed your initial perspective on the fashion industry, because I know your family was also involved in fashion, but obviously on the editorial side, and particularly at that period of time when the relationship between publishing and fashion was so symbiotic.
Well, yes, I did grow up in a fashion-centric family of sorts. My dad and uncles all worked in the garment center, so I was very familiar with the industry, all the things you learn by osmosis. But I loved fashion, and in high school I was voted best dressed and things like that keep you going. So when I was in college at the University of Buffalo, I joined what was then known as the Mademoiselle College Board. And it was a way that the magazine would reach out to its audience, almost creating a focus group before there were focus groups. And before there were computers and things like that.
Right, so this was not a reality TV show, which it sort of sounds like it would be a good one.
Today, it would be a reality TV show when I tell you the outcome of what that college board becomes. But the college board, they probably had several thousand students all across the country. Mademoiselle was probably one of Condé Nast's most prestigious magazines back then. Some of the best people in the industry came out of Mademoiselle.
Smart writing,
smart photography, poetry, editorial, everything about it. The fashion was terrific, and it was really a cross-disciplinary magazine. And so as our College Board members, we would get packages in the mail and questionnaires to fill out, sometimes some samples of product, and we'd write and send that back. If you wanted to escalate into this contest or this competition, you had to then submit a project, whether it was poetry or graphics or photography or something in fashion, any of the disciplines that the magazine covered. I was studying fine arts and graphics and communication. So I didn't do a writing thing. I designed a direct mail piece that would be something Mademoiselle could potentially send out to get subscribers. So it was a very colorful thing that folded out with lots of different things. And next thing I knew, I got a call from somebody at Mademoiselle saying that there was going to be an editor in my town next few weeks or so. Would I be able to meet with her and show around the campus? And of course, I was very excited and said yes. And I had no idea that was the interview. That was where somebody came to meet the finalists that they were looking at. And I spent a day with this editor, took her to the cafeteria and all the hot places on campus. And next thing I knew, about a month or so later, and this really dates me, I got a telegram, which there are people today who have no idea what a telegram is. And that was in my mailbox at the campus, and I was screaming, oh my God, I was selected to be one of the 20 guest editors. So that was a very prestigious thing to become a guest editor. People like Betsy Johnson were guest editors, Ally McGraw, Sylvia Plath. Quite a prestigious when you go back into the history of guest editors.
And how did that lead to being there full time?
And that was, we were 20 picked to come to New York for the month of June. So I missed my graduation because it was more important that I went to this. We stayed in the Barbizon Hotel for Women. New York was my home, so it wasn't a big deal for me, but for 19 others, it was, oh my God, we're in New York. And we were winding...
Cue the reality show.
This is the reality show. In today's timing, it would be a fabulous New York apartment that they put 20 girls up in, competing and killing each other for the
Exactly.
date
You
or the
would have
job.
you would have had three
Yeah.
nemesis.
Yeah, it would have been crazy. And we went to parties and discos and George Barkington's studio photography and met lots of advertisers to talk about their products and their things and then did a trip. And I was the only one of the 20 in my group that was then called back for a full-time job, which was terrific after my European summer.
On the editorial side.
Well, editorial, merchandise, on the promotion side. First I started in the college competitions where the group that organizes this contest, and so the next year I was traveling to college campuses myself, checking out people and promoting the magazine. It was a tough time because it was Vietnam War. People were burning bras, and I'm coming there from a fashion magazine. A little chancy. But I stayed there and then moved into merchandising, so I had an experience that is invaluable to this day. I traveled to almost every state and did events in department stores. When department stores had names that reflected the community, the locale, Higbee's and Marshall Field and all the stores before they became Macy's.
Right.
And
it's interesting. So few people in the industry get out of New York and LA.
Yeah.
Paris and London. And so
there really is a
lot of consumers.
There really is an
all those
America in
places.
between all those places.
Well, so and I will pull out from you the chronology, but I'd like to, while we're on publishing, obviously a troubled segment of the industry financially. What do you think that means for the fashion industry and educated commentary on design, on product, on brand?
Well, I think it's a loss for a lot of people because they really were authorities who had history and had knowledge and context. They knew they understood when they saw a collection why it worked and why it didn't because of X, Y, and Z 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 50 years ago. And they would write about that. But, I'm old school. I like magazines. I like newspapers. I like holding it in my hand. I don't like going blind reading everything on a 3-inch screen. But I don't think the publishing necessarily is over. It's just transformed to other devices and other ways of getting the information. And I think this new generation is not getting all the information. They're getting sound bites. They're getting Instagram notices. They're getting TikToks and whatever's out there today.
Yeah. Well, I'm always encouraged when I see the, spend 6 more minutes to read this. I like the disclosure that it's going to be 6 more minutes, but I like knowing that I'm going to get, if not a deep dive, not an Atlantic or New Yorker article, but at least something more substantial than a tweet. Yeah. Okay, so back to you and back to let's flip to the CFDA, where you and Stan Herman really were running things, and you were the proponent of 7th on 6th, which became New York Fashion Week. Obviously, that at that juncture, you had the big four. This is 90s and early aughts, right? And by that, I mean Tommy, Donna, Calvin, and of course, Ralph. And not a tremendous amount of other brands. But through that process, I think, the ecosystem proliferated a bit. And there was an American voice that kind of came to the fore. And now we do have a bit of an ecosystem. Was that the goal of 7th on 6th as originally considered, or was that just an offshoot?
No, that wasn't the goal at all. When we started 7th on 6th, which for those who don't understand what that really means, it was 7th Avenue, which is the generic name for the garment center in the fashion industry, moved right the stone's throw from where we're sitting, moved to 6th Avenue, which is the street that Bryant Park was fronted on, which we're also right next to today. And what we were doing in creating 7th on 6th was to find safe, sound place for fashion shows to happen, to modernize, centralize, and organize, because there was an accident when I just was hired and selected to be the executive director of the CFDA. I joined them. I was hired at the end of March, on my birthday, in fact, And I started 2 weeks later, and within those 2 weeks was a market week, fashion week, and Michael Kors had a show down in Chelsea in an empty loft space, where designers love empty, lofty kind of spaces, raw concrete.
Back when they used to exist. Yeah.
Exactly. None, there's no empty spaces anywhere now.
Well, there's a lot of empty glass apartments.
Empty glass storefronts actually on the streets. So Michael did a show in this empty concrete space. You turn the bass music on and things shake. Well, the ceiling started to shake and plaster started to crumble and come down on the runway on the shoulders of the one name supermodels, Cindy, Linda, Naomi, Claudia. And, people were aghast, and plaster landed in the laps of the editors in the front row, namely Susie Menkes from the International Herald Tribune at the time and Carrie Donovan from the New York Times. And they wrote the next day that they live for fashion, they don't want to die for it. Nobody remembers what Michael showed that season. Everybody was looking for where the exits are if, God forbid, more of the ceiling came down. And so I said, I think my job description just changed. And so it became a mission to find a place where the American designers, who were all the members of the CFDA, could do shows together. A concept that was happening already in Europe. In Paris, had the Chambre Syndicale organizing shows, the Camera della Moda in Milan organized shows, and the British Fashion Council organized shows. But in America, the CFDA had not been doing that. And so we were the obvious body to take on that mission. And that became my job. And I started looking for empty spaces everywhere that we could put up shows. And I also spent a good part of my time dialing for dollars, sponsorships to raise money to do it. We were the first fashion week that was sponsored by corporations. I mean, in Europe, that nobody ever talked about, Mercedes or General Motors or,
Well, and interesting because fashion has always been such a, traditionally, to associate your brand with fashion broadly considered is, in most cases, a very positive association.
Yeah. So we were actually the first to do that, and the first shows we got organized were in the Macklowe Hotel, which was then the Macklowe Hotel, which is now the Millennial Hotel on 44th Street, and it was close to our garment center, and it was an experiment to see if more than 6 designers would show in the same place, because everybody's so particular about my environment has to be unique and it has to represent my collection. And, and we're like, hey, stupid, just get it on the runway and make it easy for people to see it.
Right.
And then with getting the funding and everything and working with the Bryant Park Restoration Corp and a little bit of support from the city, we got the first season of Fashion Week up in 2 tents in Bryant Park and the venue inside the library. So we had 3 different venues. We called them our 3 muses. It was Celeste, who was in the library.
Yep.
Elizabeth was the tent on the 6th Avenue side of the lawn, because that was the Elizabeth Shaw Lowell fountain.
Mm-hmm.
And the big tent was on the other side of the lawn, and that was Gertrude, because there was a Gertrude Stein statue that sits in the park, and she would always be backstage. And designers would always dress her with pearls and hats and scarves.
And she looks so sorrowful.
Oh, she's very sorrowful.
Yeah.
And that was before the restaurant was up in Bryant Park, and so it was a heady time to put that all together.
Well, it's obviously changed. The CFDA acquired really one of the only organizing components of Fashion Week here in the U.S., the fashion calendar, a few years back. And has attempted to broaden Fashion Week to include a separate men's and women's, although I think there was a time when they were bifurcated for a short period of time. Maybe talk about those efforts and what you think the future of Fashion Weeks broadly considered is. Will they consolidate to, many designers want to show in Paris and only Paris. Many people talk about New York Fashion Week not being relevant. What are your thoughts on this?
It's interesting, and it's a very disruptive time now for Fashion Weeks. Back when we started this, and Fashion Week was in Bryant Park, and it was there for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
The first 10 under the auspices of the CFDA. But the CFDA sold Fashion Week to IMG. We sold the 7th on 6th business. And then I left CFDA and joined IMG. IMG had the wherewithal and the funding and the opportunity to bring all sorts of other opportunities to the table.
Well, full-time staffers who were dedicated to find sponsors.
And people who do events all over the world so they could, negotiate for better prices, for putting things together, more opportunities for media, for outreach, to leverage the sponsors' investments. And we also then created Fashion Weeks under the IMG umbrella in Los Angeles, in Miami. There was a swim week. We started Berlin Fashion Week. We acquired Sydney in Australia and Melbourne in Australia, acquired Fashion Weeks in Moscow, consulted in Toronto and Mexico City, and then I was going to Dubai and to Japan and to Singapore and places where everybody wanted to have a fashion week, get the IMG team because they know how to produce Fashion Week.
Right.
And IMG is still, to this day, has the largest component of fashion shows during Fashion Week. For the last couple of seasons, they've been down at Spring Studios. Nobody knows where they're going to be next. We also did a men's week when I was at CFDA. And it was actually, we didn't do it in Bryant Park because we didn't have enough shows to do, so we did them up in the 50s and Sony Studios and other places. We've done them in lots of places. Then fast forward many years later, I'm at IMG, and then I'm left there and started my own consulting business. CFDA started to want back into the Fashion Week production world. And so because there was a lot of pressure about men's being
Right.
very hot, and, thanks to people like you and people who, dress great, and menswear was becoming very
Thank you.
popular.
Yes.
And people were looking at we've got a lot of talent in this country. They shouldn't all have to go to Milan and to Paris to show.
Right.
And so,
Or show on the women's calendar, which is a different calendar.
which for some was okay because it was more media, more publicity.
Right.
And the open to buys maybe had been gone by then,
Mm-hmm.
but it was more of a media opportunity. But those weeks, so at CFDA started to organize a men's week, which I think they did a decent job of for a couple of seasons. It seems to have stopped now, and now I just saw an email about registering for men's shows. So I'm not sure what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
I think there might be another men's week, or it's the men's shows that are going to be a couple of days to overlap with the women's at the beginning. It looks
Right,
like that's
right.
it's still dovetailed to women's shows again.
Well, and as you know, full disclosure to everybody, I represent the CFDA.
Right.
The firm does. In those discussions about owning a fashion week, or I think at times those can be a little overblown, because I think IMG and the CFDA and anyone involved feels that we're creating a platform for the designers. But to the extent IMG can monetize that is an asset for them, and there needs to be some level of coordination so
Absolutely.
it's not disharmony.
Well, it became New York Fashion Week again instead of being Mercedes-Benz
Right.
Fashion Week, which is
Right.
what IMG was producing for so many
Right.
years. The sponsors had the title sponsorship, and I think after a big, consulting paper,
Yeah.
they pulled that back.
Well, it's one of those things. If they're not going to take a 100-year sponsorship, it gets a little confusing.
Mm-hmm.
It's Mercedes-Benz. It's Amazon. It's whoever that title sponsor is. Just like stadium sponsorships,
Right,
which
right.
it gets confusing when a stadium changes just its title. The stadium stayed the same. Particularly for something where you're expecting 50, 80 brands to come and come together. They may not feel that it's an appropriate affiliation with a car company. And I think that in supporting brands, that's a brand's right to take that position. But
Right, but growing up through this process of creating fashion weeks, I mean, our objective when it started was to create safe, sound places and to make it affordable. I mean, it was really about amortizing the cost so that, if a designer did a show before that in the Pierre Hotel in the morning and set up the runway, the lights, the sound, the rigging, the chairs, the whole 9 yards, fabulous show, great. Somebody's having a bar mitzvah there that night. Everything comes down. The next day, somebody wants a show there again. They start all over again and pay all over again. So the thought of having a place where all that is in place, all the basics, including security, promotion, marketing, was quite brilliant.
Yeah.
So designers could just come in with a collection and their PR team. They could personalize the set if they wanted to or not and make it their own show.
Yeah.
So it was a great cost saving. Truthfully, today I have no idea what IMG or anybody else or Pier 59 is charging to do a show.
Yeah.
But that was what the real deal was. Let's make this affordable for designers. And so that's what IMG makes that investment, sells the sponsorships in order to amortize those costs. CFDA has the calendar, as you referenced, bought that from Ruth Finley.
Mm-hmm.
And in full honesty, I don't think that that's functioning very well right now because the calendar used to have everybody listed on it.
Right.
Everybody who showed in New York, who they were, where a contact for a phone number or an email address, and in most cases where the show was and how to
Right.
reach out so that you could either get invited and call up and get a ticket or not. Now, none of that exists. Now you get the CFDA calendar, and it has just who CFDA has on it.
So you think it's in a way excluding those people that under Ruth's stewardship, it was inclusive, and she might suggest, well, you probably don't want to be at 3:00 because that's when Michael's showing. But if you demanded, she'd put it on the calendar and let the chips fall where they may, let the editors and buyers fall where they may, so to speak.
Exactly. At the beginning, Ruth was very controlling and wouldn't put anybody, double book somebody.
Right.
But then when Fashion Week became so popular, there were way more designers showing than hours in a given week. And there was inevitably overlapping. So we would work closely with Ruth to make sure that it wasn't two designers in a similar market with a similar editorial outreach or retail outreach.
Mm-hmm.
So you could have somebody doing funky streetwear at the same time as somebody doing evening wear. So divided up the audience instead of having Jason Wu and Probel showing at the same time. So that's where that worked. But then I think there was some even lawsuits at the time where people trying to sue them and said, nobody owns time. You can't own time slot. It's just, it's time. So if 12 people wanted to show at that same time and they're paying to be on the calendar, you've got to list those 12 people.
Yeah.
And like you say, it's up to us to navigate that nightmare.
Right. Well, and one would think that editors and buyers who know the brands that they want to see are going to make the choices,
Right.
that they're not going to be confused by some brand that they perhaps haven't heard of or is outside of their normal category. Well, flipping a little bit to the runway show and the presentation as perhaps a method that itself is transforming, and brands are making a decision, a very conscious decision, not to throw a full runway show, maybe to throw a party that has an element of a runway show, like the CFDA's new chairman, in Los Angeles, and invite a select crew in and sort of promote it in different ways, non-traditional ways. Do you think that is the future, and we'll have this sort of diaspora of moments that brands create around fashion weeks, or is this a bit of a blip and there will be a reconsolidation?
No, I think that that's very much where it's headed. I think people are trying to be more creative, trying to look at who their base is, who are they trying to reach, what are they trying to accomplish, what really is. I think it's time for everybody to figure that out. What is the purpose of the show? Who's in the audience? I mean, I go to some shows now and I look around and I go, who is here? I mean, granted, I don't know all the new youngest influencers in the front row, or, they used to be bloggers, now they're influencers.
Well, they change a lot. I think that's part of the problem.
But even retailers and editors for magazines, it's a changing landscape. People get information in all different ways now, and everybody's looking for the Instagrammable moment. That seems to be the whole purpose of doing all this and spending hundreds of thousands of dollars is to get more Instagram posts from your show.
Right.
So designers are cleverly, some smart ones are saying, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Let's analyze this and look at it, because it's a big financial commitment. And a lot of the industry prefers presentations because you could walk into a studio or a space, you could see the clothing statically on
And you
models.
have a time period to show up, as opposed to you've got to be there.
You got to be there and hurry up and sit there and wait for 25 minutes for the show to start. You can walk in, you can meet the designer, you can get a quick soundbite, without having to kill yourself to get backstage at the end of a show. And you could see the clothes and walk around, and you can still get your good pictures. So presentations have become much more prevalent, and I think desirable for some people. I don't know. I want to think that they're less expensive, but I'm not sure about that because you're still booking a lot of models.
You're still booking the models, but the lighting and the sound and other elements aren't as important.
I think maybe.
So I think just from my vantage point, where we do even tiny micro contracts for the people that are doing hair and makeup, I think it's a bit cheaper.
Yeah.
Maybe 30% cheaper.
Yeah, so that's a consideration. And I think other people are doing parties and receptions and dinners and club things, and I think that's what's exciting, actually. I think that diversity of the way people are showing. Last season, on one night, we were in Harlem at the Apollo for Tommy Hilfiger's show, but it was an event. It was a big event, and then we're supposed to be 10 minutes later in Brooklyn at the King's Theater for Kirby's show for Pyre Moss.
Right.
And that's an hour's drive to get there.
Well, it started about an hour late because I was at that.
Easily
I
an
wasn't
hour
up in Harlem, but I was out in Brooklyn, and it was gorgeous. And you were at back-to-back two amazing theaters.
It was
sure.
incredible.
But that tension is obviously difficult. New York, when you consider the 5 boroughs, is a pretty big place.
And there were more shows in Brooklyn this season than ever before. And I don't mind shows in Brooklyn, but when they're in the middle of the day and you're supposed to be at a show at 1 o'clock, and then your 2 o'clock shows in Brooklyn and your 3 o'clock shows back in the city, it's tough. You have to start making decisions and say, sorry, I can't go to this one, or I'm going to miss that one. But that's, that's been going on in Paris and Milan, with shows that are outside the districts. And,
right.
So New York's maybe catching up with all that European craziness.
Right. Well, let's pivot a little bit. We've talked about your background. Given the time period that we're talking about and the connectivity that you had and how many rooms you had to be in, was it difficult being a woman in rooms full of, let's face it, white older men who kind of ran the industry, both fashion and publishing, and on the sponsorship side?
In the early days, it was something I never thought about. It was what it was. But working at a fashion magazine for 6-7 years, there were so many women there. You never quite thought that all the really important decisions were done by a man.
How many were at the board meetings, though?
Who even knew who was on the board? We didn't have privy to that information. And then back in retail, when I was fashion director at Gimbel's East for a couple of years, clearly there were men running the show that you thought they don't have a clue what the clothing is or what people are really wanting to wear and what have you. And I didn't think about it. I had a PR business for a long time, and so it wasn't an issue. I think it became most obvious to me when I was at IMG, because that's a big boys club. Huge global corporation. I had great respect for Mark McCormick, who started it and it was alive when I joined the company.
But a lot of testosterone.
Oh, well, it was a sports-driven company. It was everything was built on the sports world, on on Mark's relationship with Arnold Palmer that started everything. It was, but one of the things though I have to say that when IMG bought Fashion Week, bought 7th on 6th from the CFDA, I was on a conference call on the phone with the New York Times writing an article about it. And it was Mark in Cleveland, and I was on the phone in New York. And I think it would be with Kathy Horn, who was writing the article. And she said to him, why Fashion Week? How does this company like this come to Fashion Week? It's all about sports. And he said, like sport, fashion needs no language to be understood.
Interesting.
And I thought, wow, what a smart thing to say. And he was right. You could look at it, observe it, understand it. You don't need to translate it. Anybody anywhere in the world could look at it and know what's happening. So that was an interesting comment. But there were a lot of boys there. I rose pretty much as high as I could at the time as senior vice president. I probably should have, fought a little bit more to take on a little more authority. They had the modeling division, and the fashion division did expand globally, worldwide, and a lot of that was based on my shoulders and what I brought to the table. But I didn't fight that fight, and that's okay. I moved on at the end of it.
Well, the business itself, we've talked about shows and presentations and those changes. These have all largely been driven by the speed with which consumers get information, the internet, right? And you and I have the the advantage of having sat on both sides of, pre-internet and post-internet, and this explosive growth in information and social media platforms and brands achieving recognition and eyeballs and therefore sales on the basis of that. But that has changed the model for starting a business in a way, I think, that is potentially problematic to young designers, insofar as in the traditional model, right, if you were good and you could fund that presentation,
Right.
all you had to pay for were your samples and getting those butts in seats for that presentation. And if people bought, you'd be holding AR from companies, retailers that weren't about to go bankrupt back in the day. And you could finance production on the basis of that and not have to go out and seek investors and become a national, even global brand really right out of the gates. Again, if you were good enough. Today, you need a built-out website, direct-to-consumer with fulfillment, and importantly, that ability to get eyeballs on your product, which, let's face it, if you're straight out of Parsons or any school, that's hard to achieve unless you are a celebrity. So the barriers to entry actually, I think right now are higher, even though your nearness to the consumer has never been closer. Does that spark anything in you? I don't think we've ever talked about it. Do you think that that's true, or do you have a contrary position?
I'm not sure. I consult now in a lot of regional fashion weeks. I go to Nashville Fashion Week, Charleston Fashion Week, Philly, and and Indianapolis that just started up a fashion week. And there's one, name a city, they have a fashion week.
Right.
And part of what I do when I'm there is talk to the designers. They all want encouragement and advice from me. And I always say, you don't have to be in New York to be a designer. You with the internet and with your iPhone, you could be a designer anywhere in the world. Talent is talent. That rises to the surface. But I think now, because of the internet, some younger, underfunded designers have a chance to create something without having to spend an enormous amount of money on show. It's a different scale of business. They're not looking to be global brands, but they want to be a designer and want to sell their clothes. They could create imagery and photograph their friends and people wearing their clothes, and if luck is the draw, something catches on, becomes viral. Before you know it, they could be in business.
Yeah.
There's a designer named, her name just went out of my head. I'll think of it in a minute. In Nashville, who never, Elizabeth Suzanne, who never, when I first went down there, the first fashion week, I was really, completely blown away by by her. A friend, a blogger down there said, she was wearing a great dress. And I said, where's it? She said, oh, you have to meet this gal. And took us to her studio. It was about double the size of this office. And she was making all this clothing, linen and pieces that were all mix and match. She now has, I don't even know how many thousands of square feet warehouse, has an enormous, unbelievable business, never once did a show, never once did anything, all just from being online, creating a small online business that grew and grew and grew. And she's remarkable. So you can become that, So she's not Tommy Hilfiger, but she's got an enormous business.
Yeah.
Very successful without playing by anybody else's rules. So there's a lot of ways to skin the cat these days.
Well, and I think there has been this notion for decades that the goal is to become the next billion-dollar brand. We started with my reference to the Big Four, right? All of those companies were billion-plus companies.
Yeah, look at
they
Calvin
all went
Klein
public
now, and where's Calvin? Look at
Well,
Donna. Look at
exactly. That's a good point. And maybe Michael was the last one through the gates to become a billion-dollar brand and go public.
Tory Burch.
Well, I think brands like Tory Burch and Rag & Bone and other sort of ready-to-wear brands are now kind of in that challenged position of having not gone public, being solid brands, but being a lot of things to a lot of people, which is tough right now. Luxury is currently doing well. Read, very, very expensive heritage. And really cheap and affordable is doing very, very well. Read Zara, H&M. The middle is getting a little crushed, and I think it's a hard time for those brands because their doors are closing. They're trying to pivot to a more direct-to-consumer model. They have the wherewithal to do it internally, but they're not native to it, and so they're at a disadvantage, right? They're kind of steering the big ship and trying to.
No, it is. It's very tough, and I hate you keep using that word disruptive. But the industry is very disruptive right now, and people are trying to figure it out. I mean, I'm wearing Derek Lam. He's one of those designers who's in that kind of, and I hate to say it, that purgatory stage. They're not huge brands. They're not low brands, and they're all in that middle range where they are fabulous designers, talented people, have really paid their dues, and whether it's an influx of more money from investors or, it's like where are they going to go? What's the next place up?
Right.
With Barney's in question and stores like that closing, Lord & Taylor closing, everything else closing. There's fewer and fewer places at retail. And how do you build a big internet business, e-commerce business? It's not easy.
Well, and there are designers who, in a sense, have sort of torn it down and are starting again. Takun comes to mind, who recently relaunched. Peter Somm and others. And but let's talk about what you're wearing, because part of this dialogue, I think, and it's not, these comments aren't trite and they're not, but the way we present ourselves is certainly important and what drives fashion. And you have always been recognized as a very stylish person with a distinct. No, but your perspective is always this kind of boho chic. I mean, it's funny to hear you talk about your past and the bra burning because there is a very 70s vibe, I think, in the way that you put yourself out there, but polished. So it's kind of this. I always consider Fern to be kind of my cool big sister.
Oh,
right?
I think I'm the industry's cool big sister.
But how do you approach personal presentation? Do you look at it as it's going to be consistent? Do you meander to different designers, and how do you look at it in relation to the industry and the designers who are in it?
I meander, absolutely. I spent a great deal of my early life in the industry wearing Missoni and Sonia Rykiel and even Versace way back. When I became the director of the CFDA, regrettably, I have to say, I gave away all my European clothes and said, I have to wear American designers. That's my job.
Right.
When I look back now at the things that I gave away, I want to kill myself because I could have had my own vintage shop.
Right.
And I didn't even save them for my nieces. and I could picture clearly what everything looked like. I remember it all so well because it was all great stuff. But then, I started wearing a lot of, Donna and a lot of Calvin and Michael Kors and, all the people in Yoli and all the designers that, in New York. And I still wear the American designers primarily. European wise, I'll wear one of my favorites would be Dries Van Noten, which is that boho chic, fabulous
Yep.
kind of look. I wear a lot of Lafayette 148. I love the Lafayette team. I think what they're doing now is spectacular, and and it fits me because I'm no longer the size as I used to be, and I'm still one of those people who have a closet full of every range of clothing, and I'm having to Marie Kondo my life, and I just need to make time to get rid of stuff. I like everybody else, I have way too many things in my closets, and it's the hardest thing to let go of because one of the things I did in my career when I left Fashion Week and IMG and everything, I did a month stint off Broadway in a play called Love, Loss, and What I Wore,
Wow.
which was written by Nora and Delia Ephraim, and it was based on a book by Gingy. Oh God, I can't remember her name now, but it's the cutest little book of clothing, and it's each page is a sketch of an outfit with a little story about it. And the play, the Ephraims bought it from her and Gingy Beckelman, and they created stories about each thing. So each garment I have has a story. I mean, every single thing in my closet, I could tell you why, when, why I bought it, where I bought it, what it meant to me. And so it's so hard to part with these things. And I have a lot of Indian clothes, a lot of clothes from India. I spent 10 years working on Fashion Week in Mumbai, and so became friends with all the designers in India. And I love that sensibility. I love the
Well, and
colors.
the quality is so high. I mean, people don't realize how much is actually made in India and Pakistan. And so when you actually go there directly and you're buying directly, the quality is just so
And it's stuff
excellent.
you don't see everywhere here, And every time I wear something, people go, "Where'd you get that? Where's that? Not available here." And I love that. I love the proportion of the Indian clothes and the color and the embellishments, and so my wardrobe is too much of everything, and I really need to get rid of it.
You accessorize a lot as well, which is a great, what you wear is rarely truly basic, sort of like a monochrome black look, but I've seen you in that from time to time, but you always have
Lots
a number of
jewelry.
bracelets on and lots of jewelry. Is that just your jam? Like what is it about
That's
that?
definitely the more is better, than the less is more philosophy. If I showed you the wall in my bedroom of my jewelry hanging up, we
Right.
created a system with my architect of these kind of rods that are about 3-4 inches, like like
Because
coat
that's the
hangers.
hardest thing is to
And there's
really
a whole-
see it
The whole grid of
each
them.
morning.
Oh, yeah, it was used to be
yeah.
impossible. So everything's hanging there. It looks like a boutique.
Yeah.
But there was a makeup artist 1,000 years ago when I worked at Mademoiselle who used to call me Tina Trinket because I always had so many necklaces on, and I've always loved accessorizing. And to that point, I also had a collection called Fern Finds with HSN and QVC that was based on my Indian jewelry primarily that we would make and sell on the air. And I love that, and I still love. I mean, that's what I think tells a story about who you are. You have to.
Well, we have seen a few brands either pivot to or form as unisex brands, putting themselves out there as we're not women's wear, we're not men's wear, this is a unisex line. And some of those, I had Yoli Tang on who talked about, well, where I grew up, it's all unisex. It's a sarong, so there's nothing weird about that. And I'm not suggesting there's anything weird. More talking about in terms of the U.S. customer. Do you see that as having some lasting power, or is that kind of a fad based on gender fluidity being very much in the conversation, the news cycle these days?
I think that's only going to get bigger and more important. And I think it makes so much sense. I mean, there's not a girl I know or a woman I know that doesn't like wearing a man's shirt. looser and a little bit bigger, and that kind of proportion of things.
Yeah.
And many times I'll go to the men's department to find something that fits me better. The sweater's a little looser, or
Right.
something, not necessarily the pants, but the tops
Yeah.
and things.
Yeah.
Friends of mine opened a business called The Salting, and it's all about unisex clothing, linen, kind of caftans and dresses and great big shirts. I think it's very much where the future's going, and then there are, God knows, the Jordan Roths and Billy Porters of the world who are
Right.
you know
Considered the
breaking
most
internet.
fashionable. Yeah, breaking the
I
internet.
mean, I'm interviewing Billy at the Y in December, and I can't wait for that. I'm all trying to figure out what I think he's going to wear. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, who knows? He probably doesn't know until
And
day up.
why not?
Well, another big topic in the industry, and brands are all espousing it. Some have been espousing it for, since formation, like Stella McCartney, Eileen Fisher. Others are somewhat new to it, but sustainability, and by that, because that term is somewhat meaningless, can be applied to a lot of different components of a business, but environmental sustainability and what many view as an environmental crisis that the fashion industry is largely contributing to. Hearing numbers like 60-70% of all newly produced items wind up in the planet. What do you think about how brands are approaching this? The industry as a whole is approaching it, and what can we do better?
I think we can do everything better in that area, and I think we have to. It's not even a question. Clearly, for me, sustainability is the new black, and I think it's the most important topic that we can address, and that the industry has to address. It's scary when you see the weather patterns that are happening out there, and I'm terrified of what this winter's going to bring, and the amount of floods, the fires in California are horrifying. All of that is relatable to the environment, and all of that, it's all connected. We're doing a terrible job in this country of really putting in the laws and the kinds of things that will stop this from happening.
Yeah.
I mean, and we're close to the point of no return time. And yes, the fashion industry is a big part of that. I went to a discussion last season that was IMG hosted about sustainability, and I do agree with you about the definition of that. Well, actually, before I went to this IMG panel, I was in Copenhagen at the summit
Okay.
in the spring. And I was at the first one that they did 10 years ago, and this was the 10th anniversary. And Vanessa Friedman, in her talk there, an interview with a few people, the one thing she said at the beginning, and I wholeheartedly agree with her, is somebody needs to do the definitive dictionary of sustainability. So there's a language that everybody agrees on. What sustainable means, what, organic means, what natural
And a lawyer
means.
needs to be at that table drafting.
A lawyer needs to be at that table. I think you should raise your hand and make it happen. What it means, what circular means, what, organic, whatever. I mean, everybody's talking the
Because
talk.
it's also about consumer protection and greenwashing, right?
Well, and to talk about washing, I mean, when I went to the IMG panel, I said at the end of 3 experts talking about this, including Dana Thomas moderating, who did a fabulous book that anybody interested in this issue of sustainability should read. It's called Fashionopolis, and it's easily readable for laymen, and it's so informative. But I said, okay, you've all given us so much information. If we walk out of here now, what's the one thing we can all do to make a difference? One thing that we could start with. And she said, wash your clothes less. Don't wash so much. Don't use your washing machines as much as you do. And absolutely always use cold water, and do it cold dry if you can.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, and this advice was actually coming from Procter & Gamble, who is
Makes
selling washing machines and selling, detergent. And because we use so much water in washing machines that we don't need to wash so often. And when you dry things in hot water, in hot air, and it releases molecules in the materials and fibers that go into the environment, and those are dangerous. I mean, so that's one thing to do. I mean, but I feel like with sustainability, it's almost like when people were doing clothing for breast cancer. They put a tag on it. Percentage of this goes to breast cancer. How do you know that? Is anybody tracking that my purchase, that, $8 of that is going to
It is
an
regulated
organization?
state by state. It's called cause marketing. So it is a regulated area. That doesn't mean there are cops out running around actually tracking it. But
Now people are saying, sustainable or ecological or, this fiber.
well, and this is the more troubling area because it is not regulated by specific governmental bodies. I mean, you have the state of California trying to do things independently. You obviously have Trump fighting that because, once one state takes a stand, with the internet, you're selling into all states. California is a huge market, and it then dictates kind of what national law is. But you're absolutely right. Back to the agreed language, there is no agreed language, and so as after the Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh, there were large bodies of both retailers and brands getting together saying we need to take action and put a stop to this, and they formed various coalitions, all of which had very fancy titles, different constitutions that would govern them, no real follow through on whether or not what they were aspiring to have factory standards be were actually implemented, and candidly the government saying, well, look, this is a sovereign nation. And we really appreciate your input, but it's also important for us to have jobs, and we can govern ourselves. So a lot of pushback from that standpoint as well. It's a very complicated global issue, which I think disclosure is going to be key for, and disclosure is only based on an agreed language.
Right. I mean, I was just saying last night at this dinner that I was at, imagine if Al Gore, who legitimately won the election when he was running for president, and the Supreme Court reversed that. Thank you, Mr. Bush. But if he were president, how different I think the climate would be that we're in now. Because he was such
Literally,
an environmentalist.
Perhaps. Yeah.
There would have been emission standards and changes. There would have been windmills in places, even though Donald Trump goes, who wants to see a windmill somewhere? Things creating alternate uses of ways to produce energy and electricity and everything. I mean, we are so behind the eight ball on that, and going to Copenhagen, you see the way things are done in these other countries, and so effortlessly and integrated into their policies and into their lifestyles.
Just their thought process.
We're so behind the eight ball, and it scares me. I'm not going to be around long enough to really see the big changes, but I know it has to happen, and I'll share with you a very scary thought that I keep thinking about is, the denim. Denim is one of the bigger users of water
and a big driver in American fashion.
Horrible, bad environmental product. And the dyes to make denim, the indigo, are some of the most toxic dyes in the world. And, and I keep more and more people getting organic dyes, whatever, that means, and natural dyes. But I keep thinking, and I don't tell me, Mr. Lawyer, can I be sued for my thoughts here? I'm not libeling anybody, but I believe that there's so much cancer in our society that I think we have generations of students, not people, growing up wearing denim, from babies to adults to whatever, every single day. And at a certain point in life, tight on your body. Your skin is your largest organ in your body. And I have to believe there's some toxicities from these dyes that are seeping into people's bodies that are causing all of these cancers that nobody can figure out why so many people are sick.
Well, if there becomes a study that points to that, trust me, there will be a plaintiff's lawyer that will try to arrange a class action, because I think, there are plenty of people wearing denim. One of the other solves to this, but it unfortunately involves a lot of the brands that we love not necessarily making new stuff. It's just reselling what's there.
reselling, recycling, reusing, cutting it up and remaking it. I mean, that's an exciting thing when you see people doing that in a clever way. And the rental business is going through the roof now, and that's a
Absolutely.
part of this. Like, stop buying things, rent it and send it back. Um, I mean, there are things that are happening that are exciting and positive, but I, I, I don't know. I mean, I met a young gal just coming out of Swarthmore last week who's so passionate about this whole issue of sustainability, and I'm trying to hook her up to get a job someplace
Yeah.
because we need this generation who really is committed to that, to really
Yeah.
make the difference.
Well, I don't want to end on a bad note. So you and I sit on the FIT board, and you're speaking of one student. You have always given a lot back. In FIT, you give back. Discuss your mentorship, what it means to you, and particularly in light of some of these problems that the industry has created or is now facing, and what you see in these future generations.
Well, like having seen this young girl the other day and seeing what some of the projects that the students at FIT are doing, and talking about sustainability, it's mind boggling. I mean, students who went into school to study fashion look like they're chemists. I mean, they're in labs with this amount of water, this amount of this amount of this product,
Mushrooms and bacteria.
and algae, and and you go, wow, wow. I mean, it just blows your mind. So I'm excited to see that. I mean, there's definitely interesting, exciting things happening, and the students out there are doing great, are doing important work, the work that needs to be done, and I'm very optimistic about that, and that's what my mentoring is kind of about. I get stopped on the street all the time by somebody says, "Oh my God, I went to this thing that you talked about, and you were so helpful, and you gave me encouragement," and and it's just about being nice, one of my mantras in business, and giving people a little encouragement and endorsement. And, and the planet's going to be around for a while. I'm not, I don't want to end negatively either. I think that there's some very exciting things out there. The fashion industry is full of the most creative thinkers, and that's why I love being in this industry. You never know from one day to the next who's going to do what and what's going to happen, and who's going to just blow your mind and do something fabulous. And I'm as optimistic as I could be.
Okay. Well, I will force you to at least mention, not in a plug way, but your series at the 92nd Street Y and your book, because this is certainly not the only platform that you can get the words of wisdom from Fern Mallis. So what do you do up at the Y, and who have you had on? Some huge industry players.
Thank you. I'm very, very proud of my series called Fashion Icons with Fern Mallis at 92Y. It's going in its 9th year. I started just when I left.
You're normally on this
fashion.
side of the table.
I'm
right?
normally on the other side. Exactly. And it just came out of nowhere. It was nothing I ever thought about doing or planned to do. It wasn't on my list like, okay, when I'm going to do an interview series. And for me in life, all those things in my career have been organic and just evolved. Let the universe deliver, be open to it, and you never know where it's going to take you.
It's back to the hippie in you.
I guess. I guess. And so this series started, like I said, like 9 years ago. The very first person I interviewed was Norma Kamali. And then it was Calvin Klein, and then Donna Karan, and Tommy, and Marc Jacobs, and Michael Kors, and Tom Ford, and Andre Leon Talley, Diane, Vera Wang, Betsy, Kenneth, Bill Cunningham, Oscar de la Renta, and many of those made the first book, the book called Fashion Lives that Rizzoli published. And it's available on Amazon, very reasonably priced. I actually meant to bring that to you today.
I'll get it at the next board meeting.
I actually meant to do that. And the book is full of transcripts of our talks and edited beautifully, so they're really very easy to read, and supplemented with pictures, which are the shoebox under the bed. I want to see what you look like as a baby. I want to see your parents. What did your house look like?
Right.
And the interviews are really, who are you? how did you become you? People who didn't grow up with a silver spoon in their mouth weren't asked to take over daddy's big business. How do you build from an idea and a creative vein in your body a $1 million, $1 billion business? Where did you get the money? How much did you need to start? How many
Where'd
people
you get
did
the guts?
the
And the
guts,
strength.
and then you got your first order. Who did you call? So you walk out of there and you feel like you've really learned something from these people. When Marc Jacobs was on the stage, I said to the audience, "Did you hear what he just said? It's the third time they went bankrupt." But they kicked it back and they continue. And you'll appreciate. I said, "And you still work with the same lawyer?" And they said, "Yep, we still do," which I thought was fun. But then since the book came out, I've interviewed Valentino and Victoria Beckham and Margarita and Rosita Missoni, Iman and Cindy Crawford and Bob Mackey and Ralph Rucci and Stan Herman and Alex Wang, Zach Posen, Tim Gunn.
And Billy is coming up, right?
And Billy's coming up, and Zandra Rhodes is coming up next November 12th. Almost 90 years old, British designer, the first one with bright pink hair and still has bright pink hair. And she's still working, and just, a couple of seasons ago did all the textiles for the Valentino collection. Her beautiful textile work. You can get tickets for that if you're listening to this, if it comes out in time. And then Billy Porter, and we're booking for 2020 season. And the series it truly is fun, and it's great, and it's informative, and I'm very happy to be doing it.
Exciting. Well, that's a wrap. Thanks for your time, Fern.
Thank you.
And I'll see you soon.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
You've been listening to The Laws of Style with Douglas Hand. For more information, go to our website at www.hballp.com. And you can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Hand of the Law. Thank you for tuning in, and stay stylish.